see. Anagnorisis. Oh, fucking whatever. Welcome to yet another episode of LBS, the one responsible for giving you age by clicking the link to this video. I guess that about 50% of everyone watching left out of that comment. And when is Anagnorisis, or more specifically, betrayal, effective as a story element? Within stories, there are several plot twists that are used as cliches, sometimes being able to elevate the story itself. One that is moderately reoccurring is the one of the traitor, the betrayal, a type of anagnorisis or discovery. This is essentially when someone turns out that someone in proximity to the protagonist is in fact working for another agenda, usually for the main antagonist, or sometimes the traitor is in fact the main antagonist. This can be compared to the paparazzi, but I digress. This cliché usually comes out of nowhere in order to surprise and throw off the players and turn things around, usually for the worse. However, one question that I ponder upon is, when can this element of surprise work in the story's favor? Well, if we're going to look at betrayal as a cliché, and when it does work to the story's advantage, it is only logical to evaluate some examples and look at them both from a good and a bad perspective. So, let's start with perhaps the very first video game betrayals from the first Resident Evil game. To give a brief synopsis, you play as part of a special forces unit known as STARS, and during a search to find the missing secondary team of STARS, you end up in a zombie-infested mansion with your own unit. While investigating the mansion, you soon find out that there is a traitor in your group, working as a double-crosser for the pharmaceutical company Umbrella. If you play as Jill, you might suspect it to be the fellow member Barry Burton, but it is revealed that Barry only acts as a bait, or the red herring, to distract you of the real traitor, your captain, Albert Wesker.
Wesker!
Thank you, Barry.
Well, what do you know?
Oh, don't blame Barry for everything.
Now, interestingly, this is simultaneously a good and a bad betrayal, because while you are getting the hint that there is a traitor, you also do not know who it is. This in turn can build suspense, and considering that you are already trying to fight for your life, it becomes a little more unnerving when interacting with other characters will be the difference between the better odds or a dagger right in your back. Additionally, because the attention was brought on to Barry Burton, I've heard that many gamers were affected by Wesker's betrayal, calling it highly unexpected and emotional. But the thing is, you barely interact with Wesker at all during the game, so despite the fact that Barry is the number one candidate as a traitor, it would be difficult for the player to have a real emotional connection with Wesker in comparison to Barry. This in turn makes it a bit of a bad betrayal. Yet, why do so many think that this betrayal works in comparison to some other betrayals? On that note, I have another example that I, interestingly enough, mentioned in a video not too long ago. That's right, Kendra Daniels from Dead Space, an example of a betrayal done horribly wrong. It was not due to any lack of surprise. I personally did not expect it to be a traitor. However, her betrayal did not give me the emotional impact that such a betrayal should have given me. Though you did in fact interact with Kendra quite a lot during the course of the game, yet this is still one of the worst betrayals in my gaming experience. Why is this? Why is Wesker's betrayal, someone you barely interacted with, better than Kendra's betrayal, someone who did interact with you pretty much the entire game? Well, if you saw my character analysis of her, these words might sound familiar to you. But the reason I really disliked her was because of her lack of any real personality. Despite interacting with her constantly, we found out little to nothing about her, making her very bland and obviously forgettable. However, if that is the case, why is Wesker's betrayal better than in comparison? Well, I think it comes down to Wesker himself. When you look at Wesker, you see that Wesker pretty much looks like the embodiment of professionalism and authority. His dark blue colors, sunglasses, and cold demeanor gave the impression that this was the respected captain of the STARS, and not some backstabber. Whenever you met him, he was very calm, calculating, and professional about everything happening in the mansion, thus establishing a clear character. While not great, it was decent enough. However, is this one of the best examples of how to utilize this cliché? No, it is not, because while Wesker had an established character, he still lacked proper character interaction. Ironically though, the opposite can be said about Kendra. She has plenty of interaction with Isaac, though no real character. So now one might be thinking,
well, since Wesker's betrayal was better, that must mean that personality is the key ingredient to good betrayal.
To which the answer is most obviously no. Just a clear personality is not enough. What makes a betrayal work within the story itself is all about how the traitor itself was written in the story. With Kendra it felt incredibly impulsive and underplayed, and to be honest, Wesker's betrayal was not exactly a perfect puzzle piece either. The best way to make a betrayal work for the story's narrative is by making the character itself interesting to begin with. It does not just come from one single thing, it comes from the whole. The character not only needs to have a clear and interesting character that you grow to care about, but the character also needs to be a constant presence throughout the game. I would bring up an example of an exceptional betrayal from a very clever game that I also talked about not too long ago, BioShock. As soon as you enter Rapture, you are greeted by the voice of Atlas, a revolutionary down there in Rapture, who becomes your guide and your friend.
I don't know how you survived that plane crash, but I've never been one to question Providence. I'm Atlas, and I aim to keep you alive.
He tells you about himself and his family, and during the quest, a bond is formed between Jack, the main character, and Atlas. Also, Atlas is Irish, and you gotta love that Irish accent. By the way, I'm not racist. However, by the point you meet Andrew Ryan, the king of Rapture and the main antagonist of the game, the whole game is turned inside out.
Stop, would you kindly? Would you kindly? Powerful phrase. Familiar phrase. Sit, would you kindly? Stand, would you kindly? Run! Stop! Turn. A man chooses. A slave obeys.
It turns out that Atlas has been controlling you from the very start with one simple phrase, would you kindly? Not a command, but rather a question, thus giving Jack, and by extension the player, an illusion of choice. Now, the reason for it being so good is not just because of the sheer shock of the moment, it also has to do with Atlas establishing a clear relationship with you. Unlike Kendra, Atlas had somewhat of a clear, interesting character, which made it all the more shocking when he did betray you, thus breaking the character. And unlike Wesker, he had a lot of interaction with you that actually built on his character. Lastly, but perhaps more importantly, unlike the scenarios with Kendra and to some extent Wesker, Atlas' betrayal actually made sense to the plot. With Kendra, I always found myself asking the validity of her grand plan, and she seemed to lack the aspect of a mastermind considering all the variables she could not have accounted for. Atlas, however, had many of them already planned out since he was very familiar with the place, and he was also very clever and adaptable to the situation. True, Kendra was to some extent clever and adaptable, and as we know, Wesker was also highly intelligent and also adaptable. But the reason Atlas became so much better was because, like Wesker, he was fully aware of the scenario around him. He lived there, he knew the place. But the difference between him and Wesker is once again the interaction. In conclusion, what makes a betrayal work for the story? Well, as stated earlier, it has to do with the whole, how the character is implemented in the story. The traitor needs to be interesting and substantial, and needs to interact with the main character, and the betrayal itself needs to be contextual, it needs to make sense. Now, I have merely scratched the surface of some brilliant betrayals in video games, and even less of the cliché as a whole. However, perhaps the best way of writing a betrayal is not just to throw it in the character arc to appear clever, because all you're doing is making most gamers question the validity behind the betrayal. Instead of trying to find a formula for making this cliché work, the writer should instead focus on the character itself, and try to make the interaction between the traitor and the betrayed as good as possible. Perhaps it is only at that point when the betrayal will be the most effective, and we will have perhaps yet another great traitor.
Would you kindly? Would you kindly get this? Would you kindly find that? Would you kindly find that? Would you kindly find? Would you kindly get this? Would you kindly head to Ryan's office and kill the son of a bitch?
I'm Albert Kreuger, and in my eyes, Albert Wesker is one of the most iconic villains of all time. So why did they rob him of all his dignity in Resident Evil 5? Why?